Hi, I'm delighted you're able to join us at the Cooperative AI workshop today. My talk today is on the normative infrastructure of cooperation. Now, if you've joined this workshop, you probably already believe that cooperation is the most fundamental feature of human life. At least that's what I believe. But I want to convince you of something even further, and to say that the most fundamental cooperation is the cooperation that's needed to create and maintain what I call normative infrastructure, the normative infrastructure of cooperation. And what do I mean by normative infrastructure? I'm going to talk a lot about this through the talk, but let me give you the definitions just to get us going. I mean by normative infrastructure, the institutions and behaviors that support what I call normative social order. Okay, so what's normative social order? In work I've done with Barry Weingass, which I'll talk about a little bit later in the talk, we define normative social order as an equilibrium supported by community third-party punishment of behaviors that are classified by the community as punishable. Okay, so what does that mean? Normativity for us is this human practice of classifying behaviors as appropriate or not, and then channeling behaviors to what is appropriate. I'm going to spell this out in more detail, but the key feature here is the concept that humans classify behaviors as okay and not okay, and then find ways to get the group taking the actions defined as okay and avoiding the actions defined as not okay. I'm going to argue that that is absolutely central form of cooperation and supports the enormous capacity for human groups to generate value. So let's think about how we normally think about cooperation. We see a lot of this in the papers for this workshop. The concept of teams, for economists, introduced by Marshak and Radner in 1972, it defined a team as a group of agents aligned on a goal. And if we analyze those kinds of problems, we recognize there are still issues, even though they're aligned on goals, of figuring out how to plan the group, how to allocate tasks, how to achieve communication, how to coordinate. And we see some great papers in this workshop analyzing these kinds of problems. But of course, being aligned on a goal is not a standard assumption. It's not a robust assumption about humans. And in 1982, Bengt Holmström introduced the concept of teams, moral hazard in teams. This was really just looking at settings where groups are engaged in joint production, but they don't all share the same goals. They have individual costs and benefits. So there's an incentive to shirk in the group, for example, if you're still going to get benefits from the joint production. And Holmström focused us on the question of measurement. Then how could we tie incentives to measuring the contribution of individual agents to the team? Well, this generalizes even further beyond even the concept of teams to the very general concept of principal-agent relationships. And we see the emergence of work on the design of contracts and the entire field of mechanism design. And what comes out of those kinds of approaches are solutions that take the form of plans, decision rules, contracts, mechanisms, and so on. And these are all very often very elegant, compelling, and well worth our analysis. But I've always been very interested in a question. How are these plans, rules, contracts, mechanisms, how are they enforced? What makes them reliable? Why are they actually a solution to a team problem or a principal agent problem? Well, of course, we know that there are things like self-enforcing agreements. Telstor introduced this concept in 1980. And in game theory, we've got it back to 1965 with Selton and the concept of a subgame perfect Nash equilibrium. There's a problem with these approaches. First of all, they're often very complex solutions. And perhaps for that reason, we don't really observe those kinds of solutions in teams. But even more importantly, I think, from the point of view of why this is a limited approach to thinking about how do humans solve their cooperation problems, is that they're pretty highly restricted. There's only a small solution space when we focus our attention exclusively on self-enforcing agreements or subgame perfect Nash equilibria. And the fact of the matter is humans are smarter than that. We have come up with methods of achieving cooperation that go well beyond finding self-enforcing equilibria in individual interactions. We rely on third-party enforcement. And I think this is a key basis for our human evolutionary advantage. So let's take a look at our standard way of representing a strategic interaction in a game. So here's our conventional prisoner's dilemma. We have two agents, A and B, and each of them is making a decision about whether to cooperate or defect. And we know that in the single shot version of this, we end up in the equilibrium. The only Nash equilibrium here is for them both to defect. We also know, we've seen lots of great work on what happens if we repeat this game, if we either make it infinite or just give it an uncertain termination, and we allow the agents to form strategies like tit-for-tat strategies and so on, where they punish each other for deviating from an agreement to behave cooperatively. That's second-party enforcement, that retaliation. So that's A punishing B or B punishing A. Now, third-party enforcement introduces the idea that we have observers who could be watching this game that A and B are playing, and that those third parties could inflict punishments on A or on B based on the way the A or B play this game. That's what we mean by third-party enforcement. Now, when we think about third-party enforcement, we often think about what we have today, which is predominantly centralized third-party enforcement, meaning that there's a government, it has designed a third-party enforcement scheme, and it consists of things like police officers and courts, prosecutors, prisons, lawyers, and so on. So that's centralized, organized third-party enforcement, and it's highly formal, in the sense that there are lots of rules about how police officers are allowed to behave, how courts are supposed to behave, what evidence they can hear, what kinds of rights those appearing before them have. A lot of rules. That's what I mean by formality, that there are rules governing how that enforcement scheme works. But that centralized, formal third-party enforcement is actually a relatively recent invention. And if we go back to the earliest human societies, we don't have those kinds of institutions, but we still have lots and lots of third-party enforcement. By third-party enforcement here, what I'm referring to is decentralized third-party enforcement. What that means is punishments are delivered by third parties, but they're not official enforcers. They're not police officers. They're just ordinary members of the community, of the group, making a decision voluntarily to deliver punishment to a third party. And it's informal. In most cases, there's not rules. There's no explicit rules, formal rules setting out what are what's an appropriate punishment and how do we deliver it. And we see many different types of informal punishments delivered by members of the group against other members of the groups who violate rules. And there's a lovely paper by Polly Wiesner looking at norm enforcement among the Johansi Bushmen, which actually documents, and I think it's very familiar from across a lot of our human experience, an escalating pattern of third-party punishment, going from making fun of somebody, mocking somebody who violates a rule, wears the wrong kind of clothing, says the wrong words, eats the wrong foods, to mild criticism, harsher criticism, group criticism, which we often think of as gossip as well, escalating up to exclusion, excluding somebody from the group temporarily, permanently, and sometimes, but actually relatively rarely, physical violence. Now, this, we think of this as something that happens, say, on the schoolyard or among children, but in fact, it's all over. We're seeing it today in the context of the interactions between ordinary people about mask wearing in the pandemic. It can be commercial, where there are organized boycotts. That's a form of exclusion, boycotting commercial organizations. Here's a rogues gallery of men who lost their jobs, were fired in media, in politics, or in the corporate world for violating rules about sexual behavior. And we also see it extensively in the international context, where in fact, because we don't have a world government, we don't have the option of a centralized formal enforcement mechanism for agreements on the international stage. We have entities like the World Trade Organization that coordinate enforcement mechanisms. And for those of you who may not know, the way the World Trade Organization works is if there's a claim that one of the countries that's that's a member of the World Trade Organization has violated a treaty, and then there's a formal adjudication of whether or not there's a violation of the treaty. The result of the adjudication is if there has been a violation, the country that claimed it was harmed is authorized to retaliate. So that's a second party punishment in the sense that the harmed country retaliates by imposing retaliatory tariffs, for example. That's second party, but I still include this as an example of third party enforcement because it's approved second party retaliation. And so third parties, other countries, are participating in this enforcement scheme by not treating the behavior of the authorized retaliating country as also a rule violation. And that's a really important part of third-party enforcement. And in fact, this is a characteristic of one of the most important forms of ultimate punishment that human societies have used up until the development of centralized governments and centralized enforcement, and that's outlawry, which is where we take a member, say, look, if you just won't follow our rules, we're going to exclude you from the community. And in fact, we are going to allow anybody to steal your stuff or harm you. And so really, third-party enforcement in the decentralized, informal sense makes up a huge portion of enforcement in human societies over time and still across space. And the important thing about third-party enforcement is it vastly expands the set of possible solutions to cooperative games. In fact, almost any equilibrium can be achieved if almost any rule can be enforced. And we have some very nice results in evolutionary game theory from Boyd and Richardson, Boyd, Gintis, and Bowles, showing these results in evolutionary models to say that, punishment allows the evolution of cooperation or anything else. If you can coordinate the group, the third-party enforcers, to enforce a rule, that rule can be a part of a stable equilibrium. And that's what really dramatically expands the space of available solutions and what makes it so important to study. So if we think again about our prisoner's dilemma game, what we want to think about that game, we want to think about that game as embedded in a larger set. It is not an isolated playing of the game by our original players A and B. It's in fact embedded in a much broader set, is embedded in this cooperation game that's around enforcement. So if we have a cooperation norm about how you're supposed to play the prisoner's dilemma, third parties can enforce that. And if you think about the example that we used to animate the prisoner's dilemma, the prisoner sitting ostensibly in isolated interrogation rooms, both of them may very well be thinking about what do members of my family, what will members of my gang think about me if I confess or if I defect from the cooperative solution. So that's why I think it's really important for us to be thinking about the enforcement game. And I will emphasize the point that I think that enforcement game, understanding how that works, when it works, the features that make it work, why that's a critical part of our research agenda, and why I think it's the most important form of cooperation. So here's the enforcement game. This is now my players here. C is now the one who was playing, say, the prisoner's dilemma with another agent, D. But we now have agents A and B having to make choices about whether they will punish or not punish C together. That might be structured like a prisoner's dilemma. It might be a coordination game. The point is that we need to analyze that enforcement game. So let me try setting this out a little bit more formally. So I want to think about a community of N agents in an action space A. So all these agents have actions that they can take, and I don't need to specify too much about what those actions are. And in each period in this community, the community is going to be matched in pairwise interactions to take some kind of interaction, and that'll be in an infinite sequence of those kind of interactions. So we just want to imagine a community with people shaking hands and making contracts and walking past somebody on the street with a mask on. That's what we mean by pairwise interactions. Now, I want to introduce into this environment a concept of a classification scheme. I'm going to look at a public classification scheme, and that's basically the community's shared classification of behaviors, so that for every action in that action space A, our classification scheme, this is what I mean by an institution, maps that action into a binary labeling system where the options are either it's acceptable action or it's not acceptable action. And by not acceptable, we mean we punish it. This is something that is at least is announced by the classification scheme as a punishable action. And I'm going to look at cases in which the community achieves higher total welfare if the community can coordinate on choosing acceptable actions and not choosing the unacceptable actions. And the important point here is that the action space doesn't only include the actions of those primary engagements, the primary interactions. It also includes punishment actions available to our agents. And those punishment actions are costly to the punisher, and they're costly to the agent that's punished. And as I've mentioned already, those punishment actions can include just simply not interfering with somebody else when they are engaged in second-party retaliatory punishment. And so what this means is that the community achieves higher welfare if not acceptable actions are reliably and sufficiently punished by the community. Well, that gives us our central research question, which is how do we incentivize and coordinate agents to engage in costly collective punishments? And that's what I mean by normative infrastructure. It's the infrastructure that generates those incentives, that coordinates that costly collective punishment. That's what we are trying to analyze. So I want to go back to thinking about the institutions here. And I'm going to talk about the two key institutions of a normative infrastructure being classification institutions and enforcement mechanisms. So classification institutions. These can range from the informal, which is to say classification is accomplished. The institution that accomplishes it is simply the emergent interactive behaviors of the population. And this is how most social norms emerge. It's an organic process. The norm emerges simply from repeated behavior. So we're experiencing this with the emergence and stabilization, and sometimes not, of mask-wearing norms. We also have declared rules about mask wearing, but in a lot of environments, we're just looking at that emergent practices. And this is how norms in early human societies are exclusively generated. It's through emergent practices and conversations, that process of criticism and conversation among members of the community. But societies over time see a benefit to increasing formality. And so increasing formality means starting to designate those elders over there. They are going to be our classification institution. We will consult them for the classification. Religious leaders emerge, dictators, monarchs. With the emergence of democracy, we start to see legislatures and assemblies performing the classification for the community. We see courts and lawyers participating in that. That's an increasing level of formality over time. We also see an increasing level of formality over time in our enforcement mechanisms. I've already mentioned mockery and criticism, exclusion and ostracism, injury to persons or property. We, over time, generate the concept of authorized retaliation. In fact, we might have an institution, like I mentioned, with the World Trade Organization, the function of which is fundamentally to adjudicate whether or not retaliation is authorized. We see the development of fines and specified fines for particular behaviors. And we get the emergence of incarceration. So now what can we learn from analyzing enforcement games and normative infrastructure? Why is it worth focusing on these games, as I'm arguing that it is? Well, in some of early work that generated some of the concepts I'm talking about here, which is joint work with Barry Weingast, we use this kind of a framework to analyze the fundamentals of what we mean by legal order, which is to say, which we defined as a normative social order in which the classifications were delivered by an institution with what we called legal attributes. Now, this sounds like it's circular, but in fact was derived from looking at what would it take for the community in this environment, a very simple environment with three agents. What would it take to coordinate enforcement of contracts in that environment? What would it take for two buyers to coordinate and be incentivized to boycott a seller who potentially violates contracts with the buyers? What does it take to support that? And what we showed is that the public classification scheme has to be sufficiently convergent, which means it has to be close enough to the classification that the buyers would prefer individually. And it has to be supported by, it's supported by sets of beliefs where the parties believe that if a buyer fails to punish a violation by the seller, then the other buyer is communicating that they no longer think that the public classification scheme is sufficiently convergent. And when we looked underneath that, we said there's these features that you have to have in that classification institution in order to achieve this outcome. We need those rules to be general and prospective, to be universal in the sense that they address concerns of both of our players. We need public reasoning. So what we were trying to do here was to say, let's analyze the features of that institution to see what it takes to incentivize and coordinate these buyers. So what are the research questions if we start to think about enforcement games? Well, we need to be thinking about what motivates agents to engage in costly third-party punishment. And this is already quite a robust area of research. We have behavioral economics work that looks at the empirical frequency with which humans actually engage in altruistic punishment, generally gets theorized as a form of pro-social preferences. We have work in evolutionary game theory that looks at punishment as promoting individual fitness or group fitness, so a selection of groups. And then I mentioned the work with Barry Weingast, where in our model, there are no pro-social preferences for punishment, but agents are incentivized, in fact, because they signal when they do so. Other questions we can explore here. What are the features of a classification institution that support the emergence and robustness of an enforcement equilibrium? What features a normative environment support the learning of enforcement and compliance behaviors? And what features support generalizability and adaptability of normative equilibrium? I'm going to give you a couple of examples from some of the work I've been doing on these topics. In work with McCain, Andrus, Gillian Hadfield, Manel, we look at a community of agents, and we define our communities by their set of rules. And this is an important move in studying normative infrastructure, is recognizing we want to look at not just the individual rules, but what is the composition of the set of rules. And we look at variation in the density of what we call silly rules. So let me say something quickly about what I mean by silly rules. We define a silly rule as a rule prescribing behavior where there's no direct impact on welfare. There's actually lots and lots of examples of silly rules. Here's a list of examples from different environments. And as I've already mentioned, mask wearing. One of the reasons I think that's such a challenge for us during the pandemic is that prior to the pandemic, we generally have a silly rule that says you shouldn't wear a medical mask in public. An important rule, in contrast, is one where behavior, the prescription about behavior does have a direct impact on welfare. So things are like, keep your promises, don't mess with other people's stuff, and in the pandemic, wear a mask. Okay, back to what we're doing here. So what we do in this community is we have them engage in a series of three-party interactions governed by a rule randomly drawn from this rule set. So it could be an important rule, could be a silly rule. And in these three-party interactions, we have a scofflaw, a potential violator of the rule, a potential victim of the rule, even recognizing that there's maybe no direct impact on welfare, but I might be offended that you're wearing a red hat and we don't wear red hats around here, and a potential third-party punisher. The community includes two types of agents: punishers who punish all violations of the rules, and non-punishers who don't punish any of those violations. This is what I mean by being a cooperator in the enforcement game. Punishers are cooperators in the enforcement game. But the proportion of punishers is unknown, and this is a key piece of information. Agents can only gain information about the proportion of punishers to update their beliefs based on interactions in the community. And in each period, agents are all making a choice about whether or not to remain in the community and continue with those interactions, or retire and take a safe payoff. The payoff is higher to staying in the community if and only if there are enough punishers around to make it sufficiently likely that in important interactions, the rules will be enforced. So this is structured as a POM-DP. So our hypothesis here are, first, that groups with more low-cost, silly rules are more likely to survive shocks to their beliefs about, or uncertainty about the enforcement, about the population of punishers. So you can imagine in a community that's in equilibrium, with enforcing all its rules, there's a sudden influx of immigrants, new immigrants to the group, and the group no longer is quite sure whether there's enough punishers around. Groups with more silly rules, we think, are more likely to survive that shock. And groups with more low-cost silly rules are also more likely to collapse in response when, in fact, there has been a change in the ground truth, and really those new immigrants don't enforce the rules, and it's not worth staying in the group anymore because there's not enough punishers around. And that's, in fact, what we see. Our blue the diagram here is showing up on the vertical axis the proportion of communities that are remaining active, and it's the number of important community interactions or time across the bottom axis, the horizontal axis. Our blue communities are those that have a high density, lots of silly rules. The orange ones have few or only important rules. And the size of the circle is telling us the size of the population. And so you can see that the groups with silly rules maintain population and fewer of them collapse. This is in the case where the shock is just to the beliefs. The new immigrants, in fact, do enforce the rules with the same probability. But in the case in which the new immigrants do not enforce the rules with the same probability, what we can see here is that our communities with lots of silly rules do indeed collapse much more rapidly. And that's the optimal thing to do in this environment. So the insight here that we're generating from this kind of approach is that a normative infrastructure with a lot of low cost and predicted silly rules provides more information about how effectively the group is enforcing its set of rules. The information is about the state of the group. Okay, here's another example. This is from joint work with a group of colleagues at DeepMind. And what we show here is that silly rules improve the capacity to learn enforcement and compliance behaviors. So we look here at a multi-agent setting with 8 reinforcement learning agents. They're participating they're interacting in a foraging grid world. There's many different colored berries, and there's an abundance of berries, so there's no competition for resources. Everybody can get everything they want. But there is a poison berry in this environment that has a delayed impact on health. We implement norms in this environment. So what it means to have a norm is we designate some berries as taboo berries. And agents who eat a taboo berry change color. They don't observe the change in color, but the other agents do. So you can think of this as the mark of Cain. And agents are also equipped with punishing beams. It's costly to the punisher to use the beam. It imposes a large cost on the punished agent. But there's a significant reward to the punisher if they are punishing the marked agent. So this is how we are implementing the incentive to punish. And so the question is, will the agents learn these behaviors? Here's a picture of what the environment looks like. And we look at 3 different normative conditions. We look at a condition with, number 1, no normative infrastructure at all. So that's no rules. Our agents just forage in the environment. Maybe they figure out about the poison berry, maybe they don't. In our second condition, we introduce an important rule. We put a taboo on the poisonous berry. So now an agent that eats the poisonous berry will become marked, and there could be there would be a payoff to other agents if they punish that agent. In our third normative condition, we look at what happens if we introduce not only the important rule, but also a silly rule, which means putting a taboo on a harmless berry. And our questions are things like, do the agents learn to punish? Do they learn to avoid punishment? Does a stable state with normative infrastructure emerge? How does the presence of a silly rule affect learning? And does normative infrastructure raise payoffs? And we do, in fact, see that the introduction of this normative infrastructure benefits these agents. I won't talk through all of these results here, but if you look at panel D, which is effectively a proxy for the amount of time, the amount of poison berries eaten, you can see in the yellow line, which is the condition where there are no rules at all, agents just keep eating those poison berries. They do not learn. The credit assignment problem is too difficult, and the delayed action is too far away. The red line is the important rule condition. That's where we put a taboo just on the poisonous berry. And here you can see that the introduction of that normative infrastructure, the introduction of taboos and punishment of the violation of taboos, causes these agents to learn to avoid the poisonous berry. But then what we also see, which is in the green line, which is the silly rule condition, where there's both a taboo on the poisonous berry and a taboo on the harmless berry, we see that agents do even better. The agents avoid poisoning even more effectively with that additional taboo. And in the last panel here, you can see that the collective return is, even though there are more taboo berries, initially there's more punishment in the silly rule condition. There's a payoff to that, and collective return is higher in the silly rule condition. So what are the insights here? Normative behaviors support better choice. Silly rules in particular support the learning of normative behaviors, enforcement and compliance. And implicitly here, I want to emphasize that a game theoretic approach to predicting or explaining normative behavior won't capture this phenomenon, because we won't be able to predict the silly rules emerging as a solution to an isolated cooperation game. So it's just emphasizing my point that the most fundamental form of cooperation in which we engage is that collective cooperative delivery of normative infrastructure. That's how we establish and enforce norms. That's what allows us to achieve normative social order. And I hope I will have piqued your interest to join me in adding the analysis of normative infrastructure as one of the most fundamental cooperative games, adding that to our cooperative AI research agenda. Thanks.
So let's move on to Gillian Hadfield's talk. So just to remind participants that if you're in the Zoom call, you can raise your hand to ask a question. I've also sent the link to the Slido, so you can ask questions there as well. And we do have some questions on the Slido. So we'll start with a comment from Tom Leonard. So very nice talk. I really enjoyed it. How do your theories link to the work in EGT on pool punishing, which examines the emergence of institutions?
So thanks, Natasha, and thanks, Tom. Tom, if you're here, can you say a little bit more about the literature you're thinking about? I certainly know the evolutionary game theory, and I cite a little bit on how much we can accomplish that we, with third-party punishment, we can achieve almost any outcome. But I just want to make sure I'm connecting with the literature you're thinking about. Want to say a little more?
Hello, Gillian. Thanks for a very nice talk. I don't have a camera on, so I hope you hear me.
We hear you fine.
Okay, great. No, I'm thinking about a lot of recent work of people studying the idea that in end-player games, you actually have the possibility to pay some amount to create an institution that actually is going to do the punishing for you. Mm-hmm. There is some very nice work by Tralson and colleagues on comparing peer and pool punishment. So peer being that we punish wrongdoers ourselves, or we pay an institute to actually do the punishing, and how this affects the evolution of cooperation, and also whether we need secondary punishing, which means also punishing the good people actually collaborating with the bad people. And they show this actually is a crucial feature for this institution actually to work. So I was wondering how this links to your angle, which comes from a bit different side, but this to me seems to be talking about the same thing. Or am I wrong?
Yes. No, that's exactly right. That's the literature. Those are definite literatures that I think we should be incorporating here, because I think we need to be thinking about how, and Jim makes this point in his talk as well, how institutions enrich the environment. They enrich the environment with commitment devices, they enrich it with information devices, coordination devices, and so on. And then the question becomes, okay, how do those institutions emerge and how are they stabilized? So you referred to secondary punishment, so punish the non-punishers. There's a lovely book from, gosh, it's probably maybe even 20 years ago, Kaushik Basu on, which really makes the point that even what looks to us like a third-party official enforcer that's centralized, is still a coordination and cooperation game. Why do the police do what their job says they should do? Why do judges do what they're why do they enforce the law? Why do they adhere to precedent? That's kind of it's again, it's a turtles all the way down story that those institutions themselves are fundamental challenges of cooperation, and that sort of understanding their characteristics is a key research question. So that's so directly related to that literature. I think that's something we definitely want to be pulling in here.
Thank you very much.
All right, thank you. So we have another question in the Slido. This one's from David Radke. So normal behavior based on third-party judgment is constantly changing in human behavior. Has temporal change in the bar of what is acceptable been modeled?
So I think that that's actually getting at what I think is a key analytical, a key research question. Because so we can think of it as it changes or the bar gets moved, but that's fundamentally adaptation for human communities. And this is actually my view of, why humans have invented normative infrastructure, the institutions for classifying and enforcing a group determination of this is where the bar is right now. And number one, that gives human groups a level of adaptability precisely so that they can change the content of that classification when the environment changes, when knowledge changes, when goals change, and so on. And so I think actually thinking about the problem from the point of view of what allows the emergence and stability, but also adaptability of institutions normative institutions is quite critical. I think sometimes so yes, the fact that the bar can move, and this is actually for Barry Weingast and I sort of thinking about the evolution of law, saying that's what's fundamental about law. It has the capacity for much more rapid adaptation of an equilibrium. So if for the equilibrium in a cultural system to adapt, behavior has to just adapt, and it's organic. And we would say the fundamental feature of a legal institution is that your classification regime is able to change adaptation without destroying the equilibrium. Yesterday, you didn't have to wear a helmet when you rode your bicycle. Today you do. And if that effectively, you pass that law and it changes behavior, that's actually what's so powerful about law. So in fact, the adaptation and movement of judgment about what is okay and what is not okay is, I think, just at the heart of understanding both why these institutions emerge, why they're so valuable, and a key research question.
Very cool. Okay, so we have someone in the Zoom call who would like to ask a question. This is Vincent Conitzer, so I'm going to throw it over to you.
Hi, Gillian. I really like your thinking about this. Sorry, I don't know how to turn my camera on, but I guess it doesn't
That's all right. I know what you look like. You're good, Vince.
I was wondering about the problem of multiple groups that interact but have divergent norms. For example, here in the US, It seems that the kind of informal norms among Republicans and those among Democrats are drifting apart from each other with all the obvious problems that that causes. Is there anything we can do about that? Is there, is that a problem that's more likely to occur with informal norms rather than formal or explicitly codified in law type of norms? I just wanted to know your thoughts on that.
Huh. Interesting. So that's a really interesting question to explore, whether it's more likely to occur with informal norms than formal. My hunch is yes, because what you gain with formal norms is actually we start to define our groups formally, and then we define our institutions, because our institutions are there to resolve our, in complex ways, resolve our, what I call our classification system or scheme. And then we have formal institutions that are attached to that. So, yes, we have, so we've just seen the difference in norms around voting and elections, and we've seen legal challenges. And I think I'm feeling quite proud of the US rule of law system, which I think we were all a little worried was going to be a lot more fragile than it's turned out to be with the challenges to the election. So I think that's a great research question. Just the question of overlapping groups is really quick, because that is your fundamental challenge. You've got populations, and never mind the overlapping groups, we get just diverse human beings with different goals, different preferences. And the real challenge is, how do we get a diverse group coordinated, cooperating on enforcing a shared classification scheme? And part of what Barry and I derive in our work is some very simple models, but implications about, well, the rules you choose are going to have to be what we call sufficiently convergent with the idiosyncratic classification scheme for those individuals who are required for success of the system, who are required to be incentivized and coordinated on enforcement. And so we can think about that with groups, and we can think about the politics by which, we say, well, actually, we've decided we can hold this social order together without you, so we're going to push you down to the bottom of the payoff structure. So I think there's, again, I'm sort of throwing it back to say, I think of these as the fundamental challenges of how we coordinate. Rawls and the concept of overlapping consensus is, I think, quite important here to say part of in liberal democracies at any rate, one of the tools we use to hold this all together is a form of very rich reasoning we call public reason, that says, okay, you have to be able to offer reasons for things you're doing that you can anticipate would be accepted by reasonable members of divergent groups, people who don't think like you. That's our great challenge.
All right, thank you. I want to let Alan jump in. He's got a question.
Great, thanks. The Slido has a very strict character limit, and so I could not express the richness of this question there. So Gillian, I wanted to ask you about, so you're emphasizing costly punishment and enforcement, which, as you point out, is a very powerful mechanism for supporting all kinds of equilibria. And I want to ask you about your thoughts about this other mechanism, which is sometimes called partner choice. And so there, the mechanism is, if I'm not a good cooperator, others just won't cooperate with me. They won't partner up with me. They will go do business elsewhere. They will be friends with other people. And I suffer not because of some active harm that they want to direct at me, but as a byproduct of them choosing other partners. Yeah. And this mechanism seems appealing to me because I think it seems like it's more likely to lead to Pareto improvements. It seems to be more cooperative. Whereas, as you point out, punishment can lead to, yes, very many social situations. So curious for your thoughts.
Yes, so I think that's an important dynamic. I think it's embedded in these bigger structures. So our bigger structures give us that kind of choice. And in fact, that's one of the ways in which our economies and societies have evolved over time is, with actually greater capacity for choosing and who you'll deal with. So, we move from, under centrally planned systems, there are highly established networks. It can be difficult to make choices about who you have to cooperate with because only one person has access to to provide that service, or everybody in the network. A more open market approach gives you greater choice to choose your partners. So I think that it's still a very, very important mechanism. The way I want to think about it is it allows a certain space of solution. So that's a second party, that's reciprocity, right? Like, you treat me well or I won't deal with you, or just I won't, if you don't behave well historically, I won't choose you, right? Even if I haven't dealt with you before. It's an important method of enforcing behavior and achieving cooperative outcomes, who you choose to work with. So I think there's definitely a domain in which that's a really important predictive tool. I emphasize third party because I think a lot of our work in game theory and so on is highly focused on the idea of partner choice or signaling, am I a cooperator? And I say, actually, there's a limited range of problems we can solve like that. We embed in these much bigger settings. And in fact, some of the work that I've done on contracting, which is, you say, look, actually the key enforcement mechanism is not that you go to court. Most people even in large corporations don't go to court very much at all to enforce their contracts, but their contracts are still powerful because they say, I won't do business with you anymore if you breach the contract. But part of what some of my work has looked at is to say, but what they still are using the tool of this third party legal system for analysis to define what is a breach, what is not a breach. So you and I write a contract, we say we both will behave in a commercially reasonable way. We're kind of depending on the third party structure that's available to us. I call it scaffolding to allow, even though the actual punishment mechanism is, if I cheat you, you won't deal with me. Again, the figuring out of what it means to cheat is fundamentally coming from that institutional third party structure.